Hey, my name is Emily Dalsky, and thanks so much for joining me today in What Matters Most. I want to talk about the power of the gaze, how it can bring life or death, but first we need to talk about social exchanges because those presuppose how we gaze. Let's begin. So imagine yourself walking down a street. It's not too crowded, and you see someone coming toward you. Do you A, stare at the ground, B, make eye contact, C, pull out your phone, or D, hi, greet them? According to a recent article by NPR, studies have shown that we are most likely to default to our phones or avoid interaction altogether. I experienced this a lot as a kind of spiritual RA in college. 8 times out of 10, I would be walking down this very narrow hallway, and there'd be just one girl coming, just me going down. I would almost have to brush shoulders, it was so tight. I would make eye contact, I would be smiling, I would be ready to say hi, and nothing. She would either look away completely or take out her phone, or she would just be on her phone. And I began to, because I'm kind of sassy, I began to say hi out of frustration or disbelief. While I did take it somewhat personally, I also, in retrospect now, I'm seeing that what was happening is set within a broader cultural schema. That is, somewhere along the lines, it has become acceptable and appropriate to not exchange with someone in even a brief way. My theory is we've become so damn isolated from each other because we can't even make eye contact with one another. Anyway, interestingly, Kipling Williams, a Purdue University psychologist, studied when someone walked past them and either made eye contact, completely ignored them, or made eye contact while smiling. He found that even the briefest eye contact boosted a person's sense of inclusion and belonging. So if something as simple as making eye contact with someone boosts our sense of inclusion and belonging, why do we tend to avoid and resist it? Well, Nicholas Epley, a behavioral scientist at the University of Chicago, says that social anxiety stalls our desire to connect. And his curiosity about why this happens led him to conduct a series of experiments that involved people who commuted on trains and buses. And he found that those who interacted with people on the train or bus had a more pleasant experience, even though they thought that they would prefer the solitude of, say, reading their book. He found that it was the fear that the person sitting next to them wouldn't enjoy talking to them. It was that fear that held them back from making an encounter. I want to break this finding down in 2 parts. Why do we fear that the person sitting next to us won't enjoy talking to us? 1, we don't want to bear the blow of rejection. We don't want to put ourselves out there only to be let down. It's not fun. The second reason why we can fear that the person sitting next to us doesn't want to talk to us is because we don't want to interrupt that person's day. We don't want to interfere in that person's life. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of become culturally acceptable or normalized that keeping to yourself is the preferable thing. We also just don't want to be too much, period. So I would say to you and myself to lean in, to say hi. You're not too much. And also think about the times when someone has interrupted you during the day, and sure, you might have been busy, but for me at least, it can snap me out of myself and say, whoa, there's a human person in front of me. Emily, what's most important here? Okay, so now we've arrived to the point where social exchanges are pleasant to experience, for the most part. It's better than keeping to ourselves. We've established that. Now I want to drop down one level deeper to the gaze and the power of the gaze. And 2 options really are laid before us: a gaze that can bring life or a gaze that can bring death. The gaze that can bring life. I hope you've experienced this gaze yourself. It can be among strangers, friends, family members. Essentially what happens is someone looks at you and you really feel seen. You feel appreciated and you don't feel judged. There's a warmth to the gaze. It resonates. You're like, yep, you see me. Maybe not to the depth of like you know me, but at least you see me, you acknowledge me. There's a warmth about it, perhaps even a love about it, a tenderness. On the flip side, a gaze that brings death. Now, I don't think this necessarily means that it has to be malicious or a scowl. Well, it certainly could mean that. I also think it's a gaze of indifference or a gaze of judgment. The Germans coined this phrase, or this experience, where you feel looked through and not seen as a person. The worst, I think, is no gazing at all, a complete refusal to acknowledge the other person. Now, I want to bracket just a second here and talk about, I'm not saying we have to go out of our way to gaze at every person that we see walking down the street. This is very circumstantial. If it's a crowded street or a crowded grocery store, I don't think it's necessarily helpful if we're trying to gaze at everybody and transmit a beautiful gaze and, acknowledge them and whatever. But I'm talking about those moments, and I know you feel them, where it feels like you're on the cusp of an encounter, where something could happen. Those are the moments that we want to lean into and take advantage of. Now, wherein does the importance of the gaze lie? We all have Christ in us, and when we look to another person for an exchange, we actually want the Lord to look at us through them. We want their eyes to be a vessel of His eyes. And when someone doesn't look upon us with a gaze of life, or just doesn't look upon us in general, we can feel like the Lord Himself has looked away. I don't want to sink down too deep into that, but it can feel crushing for, I think, this reason in particular. Even if it's the briefest exchange, the quality of the gaze can bring life or death, can rekindle hope, can soften hearts. Briefly, I want to talk about also the importance of the sincerity of the gaze, because you can't fake a gaze of life. I don't know if you've experienced this. I certainly have. When I've smiled at someone, they reciprocate, and like 2 seconds later, they completely drop the smile. You're like, that wasn't real. I feel really not seen in that. I feel really not appreciated. So the authenticity of the gaze is important, but we also can't fake the authenticity. And where does that come from? The closer we are to the Lord, the better we are going to transmit His gaze of life. 1 John 4:19, we love because He first loved us. It's in receiving His gaze, receiving His love, that we can actually love others well. And in a time of pandemic, as this video is coming out, I think that the eyes are super important, because usually you have a mask on and your eyes are all that people see anyway. So how are those eyes speaking when that's all we can see? All right, there are some thoughts on the nature of social exchanges, the power of the gaze, the importance of its sincerity rooted in our relationship with the Lord. May we be conduits of His gaze, and most importantly, may we allow Him to look upon us with love and mercy, so that we can translate and transmit that gaze of love and mercy into our very dark and broken world. Okay, thanks so much for joining me today in What Matters Most. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Feel free to write them in the comments section or subscribe to join the conversation. Thanks so much. Take care. God bless.